Hey, this is Charlie Thompson, and this is the too long I didn't read version of Chapter 14 on biomes. You might be wondering, what the hey? So this is a section of the East Coast. Here you can see the Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, the Delmarva Peninsula. Up here is one of the Great Lakes. And someplace in here, hopefully, you can see the parallel trellis drainage of the Appalachians. And when I say parallel, I just mean that the lines are parallel. I wouldn't actually call it parallel drainage. But that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. And I have made a lot of maps this semester for class, and I made a map of streams in California and came across a map that somebody else had done of streams of this region of the US, and I looked at it, and it's just so striking, the obvious differences in the drainage between this section right in here, and then this section down in here, and then the difference from someplace in here to up here, also totally different. Like this just looks like dendritic, but then there's like oh yeah, so it looks like there's a ridge line there to me. It looks like there's a ridge line here as well. High ground, low ground with streams feeding into it, high ground here. Anyway, I thought it was really striking. So let's take a look at the next map, which is just the shaded relief. So here's just the streams, and from just the streams, I think you can really get a sense of the topography, right? So down here, you've got these rivers that are flowing to the ocean. Here, they're clearly not flowing directly to the ocean. Something else is going on. And then up in this section is a third region. And if we look at it, just looking at shaded relief, you can see that there are three distinct regions. There's this lowlands, this coastal plain, there's the folded mountains of the Appalachians, and then there's whatever this is up here. Much of this, by the way, was glaciated. Another fun map to make later would be a shaded relief with a really close zoomed in section so that you could see how far down the terminal moraines came of these great ice sheets. And if this is Ohio, I think probably most of this was glaciated. That would be, yeah, not going to do that today. But anyway, so now we've got just the shaded relief, and you can see then why you'd have dendritic drainage and dendritic drainage and then trellis drainage, because the landscape looks totally different. But, and here's my point, after you get the hang of river drainage patterns, you can tell that something's going on. And that also gets at another point that I wanted to make, and that is how dissatisfied I am with contemporary education, because it seems to be that a lot of the things that you're getting tripped up on aren't important, but it's the way that we test. We test you on like vocabulary words. So if you were to describe this as parallel, I would feel obligated to say something like, well, okay, now technically it's not parallel drainage, but you're absolutely right. And the important thing is that you've realized that the streams in here are flowing parallel to each other because of the shape of the landscape that's causing the streams to flow that way. So we get caught up on these specific terms, trellis drainage or dendritic or radial, and some of them are obvious. Like radial drainage, it's pretty obvious when it's happening, but the rest of the time it's often in between or vague or confusing, or like what would you do with this so I could never give students. And let me keep going because I think I zoom in more. We've got shaded relief, and then we've got the rivers and the shaded relief. So you really get a sense of the texturing. And this is the Cumberland Gap region. Someplace in here is the Cumberland Narrows that we looked at in lab. And then if you zoom in a little bit more, you can see up here it looks pretty dendritic. Here, this is pretty much trellis drainage. Like I can see that here's a valley with little streams coming in across the valley. Here's another valley. So you've got a series of parallel valleys. Then down here, it goes dendritic again. But like these sections in here, well, it's not exactly trellis, not exactly dendritic, because it's reality and nature's messy. So here's just the rivers. And here's shaded with the rivers, where you can see how the shape of the land is affecting the flowing of the river. For example, like there's this big long ridge line. So the streams are flowing and they would flow farther this way, but they can't because the ridge line, so they hug it, and then they flow out here through a water gap. Here's another water gap, a whole series of water gaps. Another water gap there. Here's a water gap, another water gap. Anyway, I wanted to share with you the complexity of nature and let you know that all of you have done a fantastic job trying to deal with an incredibly difficult situation with often online for many of us for the first time. And also physical geography is just a difficult subject. There's terms, there's a lot of new information being thrown at you without any context, and you're often not sure how things fit together. And on that note, how things fit together, I wanted to let you know I'm putting up a couple other links in the Biomes, the Start Here section. So Planet Earth, or the sequel to that, there's Planet Earth 2, Our Planet. All of these absolutely gorgeous nature shows from the BBC. These are biomes. These are ecosystems. This is the whole point of a lot of physical geography, is why do the plants look that way here? Why do the animals look that way here? All of those things can be explained through geography. And I also wanted to let you know about this playlist, Ecosystems of California, a selection of 39 videos about different aspects of ecosystems in California, the alpine ecosystems, beaches, a climate transect across California, coastal sage scrub, introduction, forestry, grasslands. So I thought if you're at all interested in this, here's a good resource to get more information about the ecosystems of California. And I'm just going to go right into the too long didn't read version of terrestrial biomes. I figure at this point in our relationship, you're probably okay handling the slide transition without me doing a smooth edit later. Anyway, so these are baobab trees. These are native to Africa. This picture is actually, turns out, it's another example where people take pictures of one place, one particular place in the world, and it comes to symbolize a much wider area. This is like one street on the island of Madagascar that's super famous because it must be easy to get to. Just like in Canada, there's this one lake, Moraine Lake, that everybody uses for pictures of alpine lakes. So these are baobab trees. They are huge. They are important. They store water. That's part of their shape. That's part of their deal, is in the dry season, they have lots and lots and lots of water that they've stored during the rainy season. But it's an example of the game that geographers play. Where's this picture of? Where am I looking at? And so often there's cultural clues, like the woman's dress. African prints tend to be really distinctive, but the baobab trees are a dead giveaway that it's Africa. All right, so in this chapter, we're going to talk about biomes. And biomes are kind of like groups of ecosystems, might be a good way of thinking of it. Some of the questions that I ask myself are, if I was a student, what would be confusing to me? And I think one of the questions I'd have is, well, what's the difference between an ecosystem, which is a group of plants and animals, and the non-living aspects of where they live, and a biome? So biomes are like larger. That's it for now. What are geographic tools for conservation? We get to talk about biogeography, or specifically island biogeography. Island biogeography is rad, and I'm looking forward to talking about that. We'll talk about soils in this chapter. What are the spatial patterns of biomes and soils? Well, I'll give you a hint. They go really well with climate. The biomes of Earth, pretty much just like the climates. In fact, often the names are the same, which is really convenient. Boy, that'd be messed up if they weren't. Mediterranean climate, Mediterranean biome. Okay, cool. So we'll talk about biogeographic realms super briefly. These are mainly useful for maybe classifying plants, and researchers have identified 8 realms. They're based on evolutionary relationships. So, for example, North America is the Nearctic realm, the Neotropical realm, the Afrotropical, the Palearctic, the Indo-Malay, the Australasian, biogeographic division. So the idea is that the animals and the plants in the Australasian biogeographic realm evolved together in a way that the Indo-Malay organisms didn't. They were separated by, on this map, it's this big red line that says Wallace's line. In reality, it's a deep channel. And so the plants and the animals kind of stayed on this side of Wallace's line, and the plants and the animals on this side of Wallace's line stayed on that side. They didn't really cross over. So it looks like everything's right together, but there's a very clear difference in the evolutionary relationships of organisms, for example, coming out of Australia versus coming out of Asia. And that dividing line is Wallace's line. So these are based on, like I said, evolutionary relationships. So everything here looks like it's, I mean, they're touching, but they're separated by the Himalayas. And here, the Afrotropical is separated from the Palearctic by the Sahara Desert. So it's a barrier to the movement over time of plants and animals. And that's what the biogeographic realms are all about, is these evolutionary relationships. So a biome is a large, stable ecosystem classified according to the main vegetation type and the adaptations of the organism. So it's mainly vegetation types. Like, what's the descriptive term for what's going on there? Oh, forest? Cool. We're going to call that a biome. Desert? Cool. We're going to call that a biome. There's terrestrial biomes. That's the ones that we're going to talk about. There's aquatic, both marine and freshwater. We're not going to talk about them. That's outside of the scope of this chapter. Defined by native species, yeah. Biomes are often defined by vegetation types, and you can kind of group vegetation into 6 different types. You got your forests made up of trees. You got your savanna, that'd be grass and trees. Shrubland, that would be shrubs. Smaller than trees, larger than grass, they're shrubs. Grassland, pretty much tells you everything you need to know. Desert, same deal. So looking at the vegetation types, it makes it easier for humans to group things into groups so that we can study them. Like, I just want to study savanna. Okay, cool. Here's the places where you should go to do that. Oh, and then tundra. Yeah, and there's some pictures of tundra. One of the things I don't like about this chapter is there aren't like 400 lecture slides of pictures of these places, because I think that's what would help you as a student the most. Like, if you've never heard of tundra, you sure as heck don't have an idea of what it looks like. So we should have lots and lots and lots of pictures. Oh, that's why I've included those videos. You can go watch the videos and get an idea what Arctic tundra looks like, what alpine tundra looks like, what the different deserts look like. All that good stuff. The tropics. Tropics have huge plants. Huge leaves. The leaves in the tropics. The leaves in the tropics, they're ginormous. As opposed to places that have tiny leaves, like needle leaf conifer trees, so that they don't lose moisture in the wintertime when all the water is frozen, or Mediterranean plants. So I tried to find some pages of examples of adaptations. So here we're looking at chaparral adaptations of plants. And so what you end up having is different plants in different parts of the world that are living in the same biome look similar. So Mediterranean plants in South Africa are going to look like Mediterranean plants in North America, even though evolutionarily they're completely unrelated. They just look the same because that's a good way to look in that climate. So things like deep roots, that's not going to be obvious. Sticky resinous leaves to reduce water loss is a very common chaparral adaptation. Like there's a booze. What is that stuff? Pastis. It's a French liqueur, and pastis is named after the vegetation, the maquis. That is their sagebrush chaparral scrub. So vegetation very similar to the foothills, and the vegetation in the foothills, this chaparral scrub vegetation, often very aromatic. There's sages, and the plants create these chemicals to reduce water loss and sometimes to help them burn. And as a result, chaparral plants worldwide look similar. Desert plants worldwide, they look similar. Often they'll have light colored leaves or small leaves. They'll have coatings on the leaves. They'll have deep roots. They might be deciduous in the summertime. Or weird freaky leaves like Joshua trees and yucca trees. Little tiny scale-like leaves on these junipers and pinyon pines often they don't have bundles, they just have single needles. Agave, another freaky adaptation. Ocotillo, fascinating plant. They sprout leaves after it rains, and then when it dries out, they drop them again. Beautiful, beautiful plant, the ocotillo. More desert adaptations. Here's the ocotillo with the leaves and no leaves. Examples of cactus, like cactus, right? They live in deserts. Why do cactus live in deserts? Well, they're really good at outcompeting other plants. And that's one of the trippiest ideas, and I'm just going to talk about it briefly because I don't know how to test you on that. But it's the idea that plants don't necessarily live where they can grow best. Plants don't necessarily live where they can grow best. For example, cactus. It might just happen that cactus would grow way, way faster in other climates. But the reason that we find cactus in desert climates is because they are better than all the other plants at growing there. So that's where they're kind of stuck growing. They would like to grow someplace where they maybe get more water, but there's other plants that outcompete them in the places where the conditions are different. So plants are often right on the ragged edge of survival. That's a really weird idea, but it's also an important idea. So they're right on the limit of their existence because that's where they can outcompete other plants. They have a small advantage, and so that's where they live. Weather, fire patterns in the brush, talking about how ceanothus and lupin and deerweed deals with fire. Desert landscape, just other cool infographics, again, more ocotillos. High Sierras, alpine plants, often they hug the ground. They don't want to stick up and get cold. Often they're called pubescent. They're covered with little hairs, little white hairs that trap heat at night so the plants don't freeze at night. They often have a very short growing season in the High Sierra that they might have just a couple months between the snow melting away. After the snow melts, their seeds have to germinate. They have to grow, they have to make flowers, they have to pollinate those flowers, they have to make enough energy or store enough energy to be able to make seeds and then die in the space of a couple months in the High Sierras. So again, really harsh climate, and the plants that live there, they probably don't want to live there. They probably have relatives that live in much milder climates, but the plants that we see at high altitude, high elevation, they're really good at outcompeting everybody else in that particular climate. And talus. I wanted to talk about talus before I forget. Talus is the broken up rock, talus slopes, often caused by physical weathering. And somebody asked me yesterday if a moraine surface if moraines become meadows. And I had to think about it for a while, and they had some really good questions like, oh, well, it's going to be broken up rock and little fine materials, so it's probably not going to be very good for plants to grow in. And they are absolutely right. It's just broken up rock. But it occurred to me that maybe a moraine wouldn't be flat, since often valley glaciers are flowing down a valley, and that it doesn't matter because ultimately primary succession starts on broken up rock. So the moraine exposed by a glacier as it melted away at the end of the last glacial period, exposing all this bare rock, eventually over time that rock is going to get broken down through weathering, get crunched up into smaller and smaller particles that it's eventually going to become soil. Lichens are going to grow on it in the process of primary succession. Eventually organic material builds up in the rocks. You eventually get very, very thin soil. In fact, right here, poor thin soils. Alpine areas are going to have very thin soils because they have such a short growing season that not a lot grows. So not a lot dies to become organic material. But just a thought about, all across the Northeast, all across Canada, completely glaciated, scraped clean to bare ground up rock that eventually has become soil. So biomes, we've got those vegetation types broken up even further into 10 to 16 different biomes, depending on who's doing the classifying. So we're going to talk about those biomes and what they look like and what the plants do there. it's mainly a function of climate. We're right back to chapter 1, with latitude is going to play a role in 95% of everything we talk about in physical geography, and the other 5% is going to be plate tectonics with altitude and continentality. That the patterns of biomes across Earth's surface are a function of latitude, continentality, and altitude. In fact, here we go. These are biogeographic divisions. So we've got down here at the bottom, we've got the scale going from dry to wet and then going from cold to hot. So we've got a 2-axis chart in which we're looking at these different biomes based on their temperature and based on how much rainfall. So we're going from hot and wet with tropical rainforest to cold and dry Arctic tundra. And then in between we have cold desert, hot desert. If it's wetter, savanna. If it's wetter and cooler, mid-latitude grasslands. Cooler still, boreal forest, the pine forests that don't lose their needles in the winter. As it gets wetter on the warmer side, the broadleaf mixed forest, a mix of deciduous trees that drop their leaves in the winter when it snows, and then needle leaf trees that keep their leaves year-round. The tropical seasonal forest also might be possibly deciduous in the dry season, probably lots of grasslands, scattered trees. And then finally, hot and wet, we've got tropical rainforest, hot and cool, temperate rainforest. For example, the Ho rainforest on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State is a temperate rainforest. So it's climate, right? Because this is pretty much all we used to classify climate was temperature and rainfall. And here is another way of looking at it with the names of these different biomes. We've got deserts, temperate grassland or cold desert, woodland, shrubland, tropical seasonal desert, tropical rainforest, temperate rainforest, boreal pine forest, and then finally tundra. And again, it's just we're looking at rainfall and temperature. So we'll talk about island biogeography. This is a Hawaiian native. I think it's a honey creeper of some sort. It might be an iwi. Island biogeography is an incredibly important idea. Let's look at this. So in the 1960s, geographers started playing around with computers because all the other cool scientists were, and they felt left out. So they decided to make everything into numbers and then study numbers. And one of the things they looked at was the number of species, the number of different species. That's called species richness or biodiversity. Biodiversity as a function of habitat size. And the habitats that they were looking at, because it was easy, were islands, because we know exactly how big the island is. You can get an idea of how many different habitats that island has, and then you can count the number of different species. And the result of island biogeography, as studied by Jared Diamond and James Brown, was that the larger the habitat is, the more different species you have, which was pretty important. And more specifically, it's a logarithmic scale. So to get twice as many species, you need to have 10 times the unbroken area. So if you want to have twice as many different species, the area supporting them needs to be 10 times as big in order to get more biodiversity. So if you run a road through the middle of a park, you no longer have the area that was the park. You have two half-size parks now. So that's an important aspect in considering the design of ecological refuges or preserves to try to conserve species, endangered species, plants and animals, that we need to consider habitat, but we need to consider habitat size in a way different than many people had been thinking of it. It's not just the total of all of the habitat size added up. If you have a whole lot of small fragmented habitat, that doesn't add up to one big unbroken block. The important thing turns out to be the size of the continuous habitat. So that's biogeography. They were looking at the size of the island. The larger the island, the more species. The closer to the mainland, the more species. So they're looking at rates of new species arriving on the island from a mainland that has more species, and then the rates of extinction. And someplace between them, you get an equilibrium between new arrivals showing up and old arrivals going extinct. So a big island close to the mainland would have the largest number of species, would have more than a small island far from the mainland. We'll talk about soil. Soil is rad. Soil is the combination of geology and landforms and climate and time and the plants and the animals that live there, and now what the people have done to it. We'll talk about U.S. soil. There you go. Looks like the climate map. We've got deserty stuff. We've got deserty stuff. We've got frozen stuff. We've got really cold stuff. And then they've got a whole bunch of different names. Yeah, since this is the too long version, I'm just going to talk about a couple of them here and go real rapid fire. So the words are important, and the words in many cases will help you remember what they are. Often. Sometimes, maybe. Oxisols. Oxa refers to oxidation. Those are tropical soils. Those are old tropical rainforest soils. Also the soils that we have up in the foothills of the Sierra with that orangish color, that's rust. Aridosols, arid, dry deserts. Mollisol, the root word of mollisol is molla, like mollify. Like if somebody's really upset and you're trying to calm them down, you're trying to mollify them. Mollify means soft. So soft soils. Soft soils. They're plains soils. They're grassland soils. They're very soft. They're very fertile. They're grassland soils. Alta soils are old, like it's the ultimate soil. Spotosols have to do with pine trees. Gelisols are the cold soils. So if you remember like a cold gelisols up here in the places. So permafrost, you'd find lots of gelisols mixed in with permafrost. Andisols from the Andes, these are volcanic soils. Vertisols have lots of clay, so they make these vertical cracks when the soil dries out. Histosols are wet. Oh yeah, you can think of that like, why is your nose running? Well, I forgot to take my antihistamine. Histosols. Peat bogs. Swampy soils, histosols. So yeah, I'm not going to test you on the specific names of the soils, but I might test you in a way that I'd ask you about the important ones. So what are the important ones? We're not going to get there yet. We're going to talk about these 5. PED refers to soil, genic, making soil. So these 5 different ways soil gets formed: laterization, calcification, salinization, podzolization, and gelization. Not going to talk a whole lot about salinization and gelization. I'm going to concentrate on laterization, calcification, and podzolization. Laterization associated with oxisols. Calcification associated with mollisols. Salinization would be associated with aridosols. Podzolization would be associated with spotosols. And gelization would be associated with those gelisols. Yep. So laterization happens in tropical climates when the soil rusts. Rainforests. Oh, I thought I had a picture there. I don't, sorry. So we'll look at a picture in a minute. Laterization, oxisols are tropical soils. Lots of rain washes all of the nutrients out of the soil so that the soil is very nutrient poor because the nutrients got washed away. The nutrients are in the plants. So if you cut down the plants and take them away, the nutrients are gone. Calcification is something that happens to make a layer of calcium that gets leached from the upper soil and then like crystallizes out in the lower parts of the soil. Salinization is what happens when you apply irrigation water to soil. That over time you're adding nutrients and salts and water, and then the water evaporates and the salts and the nutrients get left behind, and over time the soil can become so salty that plants don't grow on it. So concentrate salts in soils with high potet values. Podzolization, pine trees are acidic. Pine tree needles are acidic. The soils in places with pine trees are acidic. Glaciation, I don't really care. It's cold, wet climates, yuck. So, oxisols, tropical soils, tropical rainforest soils. Mollisols, those nice grassland soils across Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe. Iridosols, dry, and alphasols, and those are old forest weathered soils. So oxisols, here's laterization. So basically the way it works is rain falls and washes away the nutrients. The nutrients get moved to the lower layers of the soil, and some of them just get washed away. This is an example of laterite. So in the rainforest, when the rock or the soil gets exposed to sunlight and air, it dries out and bakes into like rock called laterite. So Angkor Wat, the temple complex in Cambodia that they recreated for the Jungle Boat cruise in Disneyland, it's actually made from just chunks of soil. They cut out the wet soil and allow it to dry, and you can build with it, and it lasts for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. The same thing happens in the Amazon rainforest when they cut the trees down to grow grass. They cut the trees down, they grow grass so they can raise cattle to sell to the US for cheap hamburger, and then the ground bakes into rock. Laterites. Iridosols, you can get calcification as the soil dries out, water gets pulled up, the calcium leaches out and then forms a layer called caliche. Can actually sometimes impede water movement. You can actually develop a layer of calcium that'll slow the flow of water going back down. Mollisols, those grassland soils, very thick, deep soils. Alphasols, forest soils. Here we've got mollisols, iridosols, mollisols, and then alphasols. Alphasols are old forests, soils, mollisols, grassland soils, iridosols, desert soils. So here we've got iridosols, and here we've got alphasols. Going across a gradient of precipitation. As the precip increases, it goes from iridosols to alphasols. We've got entosols. This is the too long didn't read. Podzolization. Okay, I'm going to talk about that. Podzolization occurs to make spotosols, pine tree soils. So snowy forest climates, for example, the leaf litter is acidic, and so it leaches out things like iron and aluminum oxides. So you get a sandy, bleached looking soil because the iron and aluminum oxides have been removed and transported someplace else. And then down here, the aluminum and iron oxides, when they get deposited, that layer, that horizon then would be visibly different because it'd have a different color, it'd have a different texture. Podzols, entosols, inceptosols, gelisols, soils, andosols, vertisols, those swelling, histosols, former lake beds, peat, and finally, biomes. So we've got 10 different biomes, and we've got things like desert, we've got Arctic, we've got tropical rainforest. So the climate is going to go along with the biome, is going to go along with the soil. So we've got tropical rainforest, tropical savanna, tropical seasonal scrub, midleaf mixed forest. So it's got broadleaves that are deciduous that lose their leaves, and then needle leaves. We've got boreal pine trees. This color green is indicating pine trees. Mediterranean shrubland, Mediterranean, California, the Mediterranean, bit of South America, bit of South Africa, bits of Australia are Mediterranean. Short grass to tall grass, grassland, mid-latitude grasslands. And then we've got warm desert, we've got cold desert and semi-desert. We have Arctic tundra. If you're high in latitude, you're Arctic tundra. If you're just high in elevation, you're alpine tundra. And that's pretty much it. So very close association with the climates, with desert and savanna, and then seasonal scrub and tropical rainforest, and Mediterranean, and desert. Because the climates are what determine what plants live there, also determines what the animals look like. We got tropical rainforest in the tropics. Deforestation is a huge problem in the tropics. Massive, 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 massive problem. Half of the different organisms that live in the world live in the tropical rainforests. Half the biodiversity of the world is in the rainforests. Most of them will be cleared for money in your lifetime. And once it's gone forever. Tropical seasonal forest, it's on the fringes of the ITCZ. It's the savanna. Funky trees. We're in the tropics. Tropical savanna, that grassland. Lion King. Fire adapted. Now we're in the mid-latitudes. Mid-latitude broadleaf mixed forest. This is most of the East Coast. Most of the East Coast, a lot of Europe, parts of Asia. Oh, look at that. East Coast, East Coast. Huh, West Coast, not so much. Higher latitude, so there's less potential evapotranspiration because it's cooler, you can have some as a treat. So you've got deciduous trees. In fact, these look like they're probably all deciduous trees. Mixed deciduous trees that drop their leaves in the wintertime in the mid-latitudes. A flying squirrel. Boreal and montane forest. The taiga, snowy forest. Snowy forest, it's all snowy forest. High elevation, high latitude, high elevation, high elevation, high elevation, high elevation, high elevation, high latitude. Yeah, like it would be cool to have a polar projection. If you were looking down on Earth from the North Pole, it would just be a ring of montane forest. Montane forest, clear-cut montane forest. We're cutting down old-growth forests and destroying priceless biodiversity for phone books and toilet paper. Temperate rainforest, pretty much, this would be that marine west coast climate that we studied previously. Temperate rainforest, this is up the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. Very, very similar to around Mount Rainier, on the slopes of Mount Rainier at the lower elevations where it's rainy as heck, the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. Other mid-latitude shrubland, Mediterranean shrubland where we live in those 5 locations. Fire adapted, typical chaparral scene. There's wildflowers. That actually might even be chaparral. More examples of fire adaptation. Often they have big root burls to store the energy, so after the fire moves on, the plants regrow. These are cork oaks being commercially harvested for cork, and every 7 years you can peel off the outer bark. And do it every 7 years forever. So cork is a totally natural, renewable resource. Unfortunately, the wine industry is going to screw on caps because they work better and cheaper than cork, but really unfortunate. This is a picture that I took in Corsica in the Mediterranean. It's a French island, and they had actually stripped off. You can see there's a little line here. They had been stripping off the cork oaks here, but I just thought, yeah, it looks like California. I mean, it's grassland with mustard flowers, right? Cork oaks. Yeah, looks like California. Mid-latitude grasslands. It's the biome most affected by human activity. We're either growing our animals on it or we've taken it over for farmland. Deserts. You know about deserts. We got warm deserts. We got cold deserts. We got deserty deserts. We have semi-deserts, the steppes. Often lots of grazing herbivores. The highest temporary productivity is in the North American plains in the summertime. Those super long days, those reasonably vertical sun angles provide lots of solar energy. In fact, the highest productivity is on the American plains in the summertime. Averaged out over the year, it's not. But then you've got these animals that follow the sun, these big grazing herds that there's not enough in one area to support them, so they just keep grazing around Africa. They keep grazing around North America. It's interesting So in North America, the Native Americans figured out how to live with the bison. There weren't enough of them to ever be a problem with exterminating the bison, but you got to wonder what was going on in Europe 10,000 years ago before humans were doing agriculture. What sort of grazing herds did they have in Europe? Desert plant adaptations, thick, fleshy tissues, cactus, spikes, waxy leaf coatings. I love this image. This is a picture, this is an illustration that was carefully designed to highlight many of the desert adaptations. And here's a bonus question you should think about. Where would you, what type of climates would you expect to not see saguaro cactus? I'll just tell you. You don't get them in freezing climates where it freezes at night. Because they have so much water, they would burst if they grew in regions where it regularly freezes. So places with hard freezes, even though it could be dry enough that they would be just fine, they would burst because the water expands 9% when it freezes. When I heard that, I thought, oh yeah, that seems obvious. I never would have thought of it on my own, but now that I hear it, it's totally obvious. Saguaros. Arctic and alpine tundra. Arctic is high latitude, alpine is high elevation. Occurs at all latitudes at high elevations. So scrubby stuff, again, high elevation, high latitude, high elevation. Probably both. So you're not going to get trees, or if you do have trees, they're going to be very, very dwarf willows, for example, in Alaska. Lots of moss, lots of lichen, very low growing stuff. The storms, typically very powerful, lots of ice, so if you stand up, you'd get blown over by the storms. Musk oxen, I wanted to talk about climate change and musk ox, and one of the issues facing them is as it gets warmer, it's starting to rain in the winter. So these animals have lived in the Arctic for thousands and thousands of years, and they've done just fine. But now they're starting to have problems because in the winter, it'll actually rain, and then their fur the insulation is gone, and they can die because it's cold, because it's not cold enough to keep the water frozen, which is really tragic. Tundra, and then anthropogenic biomes, humans for agriculture, for forestry, for cities, all those we've modified a large portion of Earth's surface. That's pretty much it for the too long didn't read. I'm going to go record the full on, oh my God, it's so long version of the biomes. Good luck.